Welcome to the Sober Christian Gentleman Podcast. This is Henry. I decided to do a podcast on education. I try to take a stab at giving a summary history of how we got here. From the education that we know of the couple thousand last years of history, and then how it's moved through and like bobbed and weaved and twisted back and has been manipulated by the power structure. The parasite class that basically controls us, controls access to information, controls access to education, controls access to the thing called the Trivium, which is your ability to think and learn how to learn. It's a fascinating thing. When you start understanding the Trivium, you'll see how that it can actually apply to almost anything. That's what I'm going to try to explain in this podcast, give you some background on it, and see where we end up. We will begin with an opening prayer. God, give us the patience to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. God, give us discernment so we can see with clarity, followed by conviction, to act appropriately at all times and in all things. We ask that you bless us with the armor of God, cloak us with your divine protection, so that we may boldly walk in the world, to courageously be the peacemakers and make the world a better place for all your children. We ask that you move our hearts so that we know when to use the sword of the Spirit or the sword of steel to do right for ourselves, our families, and our communities. We ask that you move us in constitution to be humans who stand tall with courage, speak truth, and lead by example. We pledge on our sacred honor to rebuke evil, to speak out against evil, and to act to stop evil. We ask that you move our hearts so that we may know with absolute certainty the best way for us as individuals to act in our own way. In the power and in the name of Jesus Christ, we banish all negative entities, all evil spirits, all demons from our presence immediately. In the name of Jesus Christ, we command you, we compel you with the power of the Most High God to leave our presence for now and forever. Do not return, go now. In the name of Jesus Christ, we express with our full intention, with our freedom of choice, this area is now declared with the authority of Jesus Christ unequivocally, absolutely, totally clear of all evil entities, spirits, and energies. We say these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
I thought I'd make a podcast on education because a lot of people do not seem to get it. But what's going on? I've touched on this in many different podcasts, kind of collaterally, but not as a specific topic as a standalone topic. And so I thought I'd actually do that to help people who are trying to teach their children or teach their family or their loved ones and trying to figure out why everything's going so screwed up and sideways. And you have to understand the point of the education system is to dumb down children, to make them dumb people who are easy to mislead, who are easy to manipulate. That's the point. It's to create idiots. It's an idiot factory. You put them in on one end of the conveyor belt and out the other end comes idiots. What's an idiot? It's someone who doesn't have full capacity. They're not actually able to actually think for themselves. So the history of education, as we know it today, is very interesting. There was actually a guy named John Taylor Gatto that wrote a series of books, and his books are fantastic because the sucker punch that came from him was that he was a teacher in New York City, and he actually won awards for the best teacher in New York year after year because he produced so many brilliant students that were very capable. They were like gifted kids, and it was a mystery, like, how does this guy keep producing crop after crop of gifted kids? And finally there's an investigation into him because the powers that be do not want gifted kids. They want idiots. They want morons who will do what they're told, who will believe what they're told, who will not think critically, not think for themselves. They'll just follow orders. They'll that's it. They want low IQ morons to just be able to do the job that they're given. And what's fascinating about it is when you look at John Taylor Gatto. So at one point, there was an investigation into him, and it was revealed what he was actually doing. So the reason why he was able to get these kids to excel was that he did not actually teach the curriculum the school gave him. That was his secret. He actually saw it for what it was. The curriculum was made to create morons, and he was trying to actually help children become their best and have a capacity that was exemplary. So what he did is very straightforward. He basically threw the curriculum out, and when students came to him, he basically let them follow their interest. And this is the thing that's so fascinating about children, is that when children follow their interest, they're like a sponge that will soak up every little bit of information possible and then apply it in the most creative ways. So what he did, John Taylor Gatto, was that he basically in his classroom, he allowed children to follow their interests. If they're interested in astronomy, he would provide books on astronomy so they could learn about it and read about it. And he just basically filled their curiosity with opportunity to learn. And that was the secret. If they're interested in history, he would provide them quality history books that would give them an insight into what was going on. If they're interested in math, he'd provide them with quality math books that would teach them how to do math themselves. So he didn't have to actually teach them how to do math. He would just help them learn how to do math on their own, because there's tens of thousands of books on every subject you can imagine. And there's all kinds of different teachers who wrote books about it. So what would happen is he would take these children who could read and write and basically help them read and write better, because as a child reads books, their vocabulary and their diction increase exponentially, because especially when they want to learn something, they actually absorb everything like a sponge. They learn new words. They're able to apply the words because they've seen it in context, and they become these little geniuses, right? So this is what he did. He basically gave them increasingly complex books on a subject until their interest petered off, and then they would be interested in something else, and he would give them books on that subject. And so basically, instead of having to sit around and drag them by the nose to do something, he just basically followed their interest. If they're interested in music, he provided them books on music and musical instruments to practice with. It sounds kind of chaotic, but it was actually very straightforward, because he would actually help them help themselves, and he basically was teaching the Trivium method without teaching the Trivium method. And this is it's fascinating, because so this guy, John Taylor Gatto, finally got fired because he was basically overeducating the children and making everyone else look bad. And see, the point of the education system is to dumb people down. They don't want this error range popping in where they have this one class that's doing awesome and every other class doing terrible, because the point of the operation is to do terrible and make it seem like there's nothing the school can do, because they just got a bunch of dumb kids. But really what's going on is they have kids and the school's teaching them to be dumb. The work product for the school is dummies. And once you understand that's what's actually going on, then you start looking around and you see all the evidence for it. It's so obvious, it's ridiculous. But if you don't know what you're looking for, you can't see it when it's right in front of your face. So John Taylor Gatto got fired after winning all these awards, and finally started writing books about the education system. He wrote one book called Dumbing Us Down, and then a whole series of books on the history of education. And that's where he was the one that really popularized a lot of ideas of how education came to where it is today, because he was able to dig it up. Once he started writing books, he was self-funded, basically a self-made man, and he was able to actually spend the time doing the things he would have done otherwise if he wasn't teaching kids to not be stupid, right? So there's a whole series of schools started up that were called, I think they're diseducation or unschooling. There's a whole series of schools that were like unschooling schools, where basically you drop your kids off in the morning, come pick them up in the evening, and who knows what they learned, but they learned something interesting, and they're basically becoming brilliant. And then these schools are being shut down by the government because it made what they were doing in the government-funded schools more obvious, right? How can you take a kid who's allegedly a troubled kid who's just is a moron and no one can help him, take him out of the government school, drop him into one of these unschooling systems, and he all of a sudden becomes a genius? You know, I'm not saying all of a sudden, but like in very short time, he becomes a genius. He starts actually applying himself. His language skills get improved. His reading skills are improved. His writing skills become improved. Everything becomes improved because he's actually engaged. He cares about what he's doing. And because he's actually in it to win it, all his acuities all go up. His propensities change. His orientation changes. And now he becomes a brilliant kid. This is what's so fascinating, is that when you look at this system that's going on, the people who are controlling the system are communists, whether they know it or not. And this is what's so terrible about it, is all the people who are officially allowed to teach in government schools have all been into communist indoctrination camps called universities. So these are people who went through school and excelled in the dumbing program, so they're basically excellent dummies. And then they go through the next phase of their dumbification called university. And through the university system, they make them not only more idiotic, but they turn them into communists. And many of them have no idea. It's the only way you get a job in public education these days is to be a communist idiot. And if you toe the line, whether you're a real believer or you're just in it for the money, either way, the damage you're causing is the same thing. So that's what's basically going on. This is the problem, is that all these teachers, either knowingly or unknowingly, are destroying children's minds and creating a crop of communists that are going to bring in a communist government to destroy everything you know. Some of them know what's going on and they're actively cheering for it. Other ones don't know what's going on, but they're happy to take the paycheck and do whatever they're told. This is what's so infuriating. Until you understand what's going on, it doesn't make sense. So the point of the schooling system is to dumb children down, to make them idiots who are just smart enough to follow the orders they're given, but not smart enough to think about it for 2 seconds. This is the point of education. It's a dumbing down program. You give your kids off to the education program, they come back idiots. Now, there's a study that's really important to understand. This study was actually done by, so it was funded by NASA, which has more money than they know what to do with. NASA's a giant fraud, but the point is, NASA actually funded this education research where they're trying to figure out how to make more geniuses. I've said this in another podcast, but it's important to put into here, because so if you've never heard it before. So NASA actually paid this scientist who was studying geniuses and high IQ people to understand, like, how do you actually create more geniuses, or where's the problem here? So NASA actually funded this research that was meant to figure out where are all the geniuses going. And what he did was he started looking at kindergarten. He found out that in kindergarten, 80% of people, the children, are actually geniuses. They're like 80% of the kindergarten class is geniuses. Then he went to the first grade. He found out 70% were geniuses. Second grade, 60% were geniuses. Third grade, 50% were geniuses. As he went up the line, the genius level fell down all the way up to high school, where there was 1 out of 1,000 kid was considered a genius. And then when he got to university, it was like 1 out of 100,000 or 10,000. It's like a fluctuating range depending on the university. And what he found was that the higher the education, the dumber the kid was. And he did this study, and he did a study again the next year. He found the exact same statistics. Did the study again the next year, found the same statistics. Very little standard deviation in the actual results. So he found that this thing was consistent, congruent. There was momentum here, and it was not changing. He did it for 10 years, and then he finally said, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. I don't care if you keep paying me. This is ridiculous. He said, okay, if you want to have more geniuses, don't send any children to school, because schooling dumbs them down.
It makes them idiots. That was his conclusion. He said from the data that he could find, there's no other way to read this. Children who don't go to school maintain their genius qualities to adulthood. Any child that has gone through public government education gets dumbed down to the point where they're retards. So he said, if you want more geniuses, don't send your kids to school. Don't send any kids to school, and society will be way better. This was his conclusion. It's fascinating because this proves the concept that the point of government education is to dumb people down. And when you start tracking the timeline of when things started happening the way they were, the major change happened back in the 60s. This is where I'm going to go back really in history to explain how we got to this point, but the 60s is a really important inflection point. The reason why I want to point it out is that after World War II, when the West basically won World War II collectively, and they were trying to figure out what they were going to do next, like the people who are actually in charge, not the actual politicians and stuff, the people were deciding, okay, we need a one world government. These are the people in the shadows who control everything. They said, we need a one world government, but we're not sure how to get there because people are still not stupid enough to go for a one world government where we're going to have to kill most of them, and somehow they're going to have to accept it. So we have to figure out how to dumb people down enough to be able to kill them with their consent so that they go along with the program and basically dive into the wood chipper and think it's a good idea. So they went through the series of think tanks and explorations, and they actually created a book called Limits of Growth. And Limits of Growth basically laid out the concept that they were going to use climate change as a concept. And they said it doesn't matter if it's real or fake because the end is the same. We have to just pretend that climate change is happening because it's a good excuse to be able to withdraw people's liberty, withdraw their personal rights, and have them be guilty for being alive. And by creating this scenario where the fact that they're alive is creating a problem. And the only way to offset their guilt of being alive creating the problem is to go along with the program that the globalists were going to create. It's important to understand we're not actually on a globe. That's a falsehood that the globalists created. That we're actually on a plane. That we're on a plane. That's what the Earth is. The point is that these guys are about deception in every turn. So they deceive. So they realized they needed to create this fake climate change concept to be able to guilt people into giving up their lives for the greater cause, but in a managed decline. They wanted to be able to pull out all the geniuses from school to be able to put them to tasks on Team Evil, right? They wanted to pull out the people with the high IQ, really achievers, and put them on tasks that were deceptive, as in you didn't know you were working on Team Evil to wipe out the population. You thought you were doing something good when really the data you're collecting or the information, the problem you were solving was actually going to be twisted in a minute to actually kill everyone. That's how they operate. So anyways, they had this project and they had this book called Limits of Growth where they basically laid out their whole plan, and then they created what was called the Agenda 21. Agenda 21 was this multinational agenda for the 21st century. It's 100 years in the 21st century, and that's where they thought they would get the most gains from the year 2000 to 2100. And this 100-year cycle was broken up into 10 decades. So it's Agenda 2000, Agenda 2010, Agenda 2020, Agenda 2030. See how in Agenda 2040, Agenda 2050 goes into decade cycles. And they broke it down into little baby steps where they had to achieve certain goals. There was milestone markers to realize that they're getting towards their goal of one world government. They laid it all out. There was actually a report called the Iron Mountain Report that laid a lot of this stuff out. It was kind of like a document that was used internally within their inner workings that was actually released to the public by a couple whistleblowers that came forward and explained what was going to happen. But people didn't believe them because it was just too horrific. It was too gargantuan. It was just so evil that people just could not wrap their mind around it. They thought it was fantasy. Even though there was this Iron Mountain Report, and there's Agenda 21, you can actually find a lot of the documents on. After the 60s, they started popping up all these front-facing organizations like the World Economic Forum, United Nations, and then the World Health Organization. And there was this whole series of government organizations that were one world government organizations that were dressed up as one thing that was meant to be something else in a little bit of time. And this is where they unleashed their plan.
And it's really fascinating when you follow this history, because right in the 60s is where they started implementing on a national level all these education programs. They started in the United States, they started saying, oh, all these black people are just so stupid. What's wrong? Oh, well, it's because of the government. Yeah, the government is racist and evil, and historically there's all these problems, so we need to standardize education to give all these black people a better education. But see, they were totally lying about all that stuff, because that's not true. Before government education, the government schooling system through the Board of Education, which is a federal bureau that came in to standardize education, before the Bureau of Education came in, 95% of black families in the United States were part of a whole family. It was mother, father, and the children together in one house, and they're all very well educated. They actually, if they were not educated at a university level, they're educated at a college level to basically have a trade, and they were able to be independent and do really well for themselves. Most of them actually own their own homes. The only exception to that was the public housing areas, where there was like the welfare plantations going on that was created by the government. And this is where it went into acceleration mode. So before the Board of Education and all this government policy that was supposed to alleviate poverty, 95% of black households were a whole family, mother, father, and the children together. They're all working. They all had wealth within their means. Now, after 30 years of the Board of Education coming in and all these social welfare programs and the government messing with stuff, you now have a 25% family rate in the black community. It's declining every year. So only 25% of families are actually together with his mom and pop in the family with the kids, and they're all working and have a house and all that stuff, right? They have basically the means to acquire what they want in life. Only 25% have that now because of the government manipulation, which impoverished everyone and destroyed families. They created welfare systems whereby the only way a mother could get the maximum welfare check was to not have a father in the home. So the mother would kick the father out and have these kids without fathers so that she could get the maximum amount of welfare check from the government. But then the father was not able to be at the home, so then what was he to do? He ended up going off and getting someone else pregnant, and then he'd get kicked out of that home too. So there's all these broken families. Everything was all twisted. There was like half brothers, half sisters everywhere. The whole thing was like a perverse incentive where you were getting paid to be retarded and to be dysfunctional and to destroy your family. That was the government paycheck. Was the most destructive you could be to your family, was where the biggest paycheck came from, and they had these perverse incentives to destroy the family. This all comes down to the education, because again, the Board of Education brought in the standardization, which made people dumber over time. The more they implemented these phases of education upgrades, the dumber the children got. And this is the point that's really important to understand, is that the more the government intervenes in the educational process of children, the dumber the children are at the end process. The end product is retards. And you got to understand that's the point, because the globalists want retarded people who need the government, and they're in this cycle of like abuse, right? Where they just hold on to their abuser because they think their abuser is necessary for them to maintain life, when really they don't. If they were actually free from the abuse situation, they'd actually be able to go off and actually be free and find their own way in life, and they just can't figure that out because of the education system that makes them dumb. This is the whole cycle of stupidity. It's a rinse and repeat. And it creates intergenerational stupidity where people can't seem to get out of the problem they're in. The problem they're in is created by government, and they keep holding on to government, which keeps crippling them even more. It's a cycle of insanity. So I'm going to go into some deep dive history here and then bring it back up to speed so it'll make sense in context, because it's really important to understand how we got here. When you understand how we got here, you can see how this whole thing was very contrived. It was a scheme from the beginning, and it's been followed through by all these very nefarious people who are sociopaths on one side and psychopaths on the other, and the whole way around, it's bad for everyone around them. So the history of education is pretty interesting, because you get into ancient history, you get into the mystery schools. People used to go off to these different special education camps where they'd come back knowing the Gnostic secrets and stuff like that. As far back as we have civilization, we have these mystery schools where you had to be an initiate into the mystery school, and you'd come out and go through society doing whatever the mystery schools want you to do.
since time immemorial, we've had the same situation of you've had Team Evil with their handlers, which is the shadow people, always manipulating society in some way to get the results they want. So way back in the mystery schools, they did this, and they would get their guys to be advisors to kings, advisors to emperors, advisors to royalty. And they basically had these networks that were intelligence networks that had information going both ways. So the shadow people were able to know what was going on from their agents all over the place. They had different ways to communicate, and it gets pretty complicated when you go back because it's pretty fascinating. And I don't want to actually get into that in this particular podcast. But what's important to understand is that they had their ways of communicating way back since we can remember. Then you get into the more modern day time. And what happened was in the last, say, 500 years, you can look at that block. And what happened was you started this new thing, which is called the universities. And the universities was a rebranding of the mystery schools, where they basically gave universal education. And originally, the universal education was to teach the Quadrivium and Trivium. Now, the Trivium is about reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's basically learning how to learn and then applying it universally from that point on. And it gets pretty fascinating because the Quadrivium is 4 more sections that go off, and they basically are teaching music and rhythm, and they teach poetry in different ways to actually get your brain working in a more complex, nuanced way. So they actually taught art as well, because art was a visual kind of medium whereby they were helping people understand how to visually see the world. And it gets really interesting because in higher education, in the original Quadrivium, they taught music and art as different expressions and extensions of human learning. And it gets very interesting because that was the premise that by which it was sold, and people got these universal educations, so they were very well versed in reading, writing, arithmetic, poetry, music, art. They were all accomplished artists and musicians. When you came out of these universal education schools, you were basically a well-rounded individual who understood history. They taught logic. They taught how to express yourself properly, like how to actually communicate in a way that was easily understandable to others. It's really quite fascinating when you actually study this thing, because the universal education idea was really fantastic. And then they took this concept of the universal education and they warped it into a really weird way, where they took the concept of universal education and they changed it over time. But it's important to understand this is the foundation of Western kind of society as we know it, the universal education. Now, what's interesting is way back the Greeks and the Romans, they had their versions of these universal educations, and they also taught the Trivium and Quadrivium. So what's really fascinating is that through this 500-year chunk, when the Western world was having this surge of what was called the Enlightenment, when people stopped being backwards and retarded because of the Catholic Church, which dominated the world at the time, that repressed everything because they want to maintain control. So to maintain control, they had to destroy everything that would come in contact or conflict with their control. Having people wanting to be free was contraindicative of them being in control. So the Catholic Church was basically a religious front to a political order that was a one world order. And what was fascinating is, I know I'm wandering a little bit, but I'm trying to get to the punchline here, and it's important to understand this backstory, is that before you had the Roman Catholic Church, you had what was called the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire had multiple different families that were interconnected through very convoluted networks that had different power structures around the world. And the Roman Empire was gargantuan for a long time. Now, what ended up happening to the Roman Empire is it got so big that it was so corrupt that it required so much energy just to maintain itself that it fell apart over time. And what ends up happening is there's been multiple empires over the years who've done the same thing. They basically become dominant, And then because their parasitic nature is how they maintain control, they inevitably overconsume and get to the point where they take so much resources to maintain power that they actually fall under the weight of their own corruption. If you look at the United States right now, that's what's going on. The United States is so corrupt that it's becoming unmanageable, unworkable. There's just so much fraud on top of fraud on top of fraud. It's ridiculous. And it takes so much bribery and money running around to bribe everyone and keep them bribed that's untenable to maintain the situation for much longer. The United States federal government is so corrupt that it's ridiculous. And the only thing that they can do is get more corrupt, bribe more people, print more money, make the money disappear, shuffle it around, invest it, reinvest it, and it's just getting ridiculous. And it's about to fall apart. This is not the people of the United States. This is the illegitimate appearance of a federal government. It's not even the government of the, what would you call the original founding of the United States was on a principle of, the Republic. But since the Civil War, the Republic is no longer around. They basically folded that under, put it to sleep, and started 3 corporations under the same name as the United States of America. Anyways, it gets pretty wild going through that history. I'm trying to avoid that by trying to be succinct, and it's difficult because there's a lot of steps to get us here. What is important is for the modern understanding of education is that not long ago, only the super elite and super rich and super connected were able to afford and were even permitted to enter these states of higher learning. These states of higher learning were basically places where only the elite went. You had to be born to the right people. You had to have the right pedigree. You had to be currently in vogue, as in good standing with the corrupt power structure. And if all those things were met, they would actually let you in to this higher education, this universal education, and you'd come out the other end a gentleman. Now, what's fascinating is they took this concept and they saw that it was good, and they did a lot of interesting things with it, but then what inevitably happened was the people who run things, who are super corrupt and super occult and very satanic, basically went too far with it. And they basically created a system by which it became so elite that it became not really usable in a larger way. So they had to actually diffuse things down to create this higher education. And they went through several iterations of the universal education, and settled on something later on that was kind of simplified of the higher education that the elites actually went to. Originally, they were actually trying to groom highly intelligent, highly capable individuals to basically rule the world. After a while, they kind of gave up on that because they just didn't need it. But the important thing to understand is that originally, the universal education, which is the universities, gave you a full education in the Trivium and the Quadrivium, and these concepts were understood by the founders of the United States of America. So what ended up happening was the country that was the most exemplary for implementing the concept of the Trivium and the Quadrivium was the actual founders of America when they actually founded the Republic. And they actually taught the Trivium everywhere. And what's fascinating is when the original kind of founders were doing their thing in the United States of America, there was no universities at the time. We're talking about wild lands that were being settled, and there was all kinds of things going on. There was conflicts that they're dealing with, and there was not the established kind of old schools, right? They had to actually cut the forest down, level things out, build farms and stuff. So people were pretty busy doing their thing, and there was not the established old world institutions that were there for the rest of Europe. So this is where there's an opportunity, where there was something that actually happened that was different than through the rest of Europe. And what this was that the founders of the United States were deep thinkers, but they were doers. They were people who worked with their hands every day. These were farmers who, for the most part, farmed to live. They actually grew the food that they ate. They were dealing with animal husbandry. They were dealing with a practical farm life, and they were thinking of higher thoughts. So what happened is, if they're in the northern climates compared to the southern climates, in the north, you have 4 seasons, and you'd have these seasons where in the summer people would work really hard to get the crops in, to harvest the crops in the fall, and then they'd basically settle in for winter, and they had a couple months of being under the snow. So since they had this downtime, they were able to think and sit around and actually talk about stuff. Back then there was no television, no radio, barely any newspapers, and people basically were able to communicate. And what happened was there was a revival of the Renaissance ideals, and they brought back the idea of the Trivium. And what's really fascinating is that the founders decided, hey, why don't we just implement the Trivium to educate everybody? It was the ultimate idea of equality, equal education for all. Everyone had the opportunity to be part of this thing. That was the education of the colonies. So what ended up happening was, instead of actually having like universities and universal education, they had everybody in the village would get together and universally educate the children. And then sometimes there'd be like someone who just liked being an educator, and they'd be the general teacher, and people would go to their house, and that's where kids were hanging out, learning how to do stuff. Now, what you got to understand about the Trivium is a very efficient way to teach, because the basis of the Trivium is that you learn how to learn, right? The Trivium is about learning how to learn. And once you learn how to learn, then you can teach others how to learn as well. And what's amazing about the Trivium is that you can learn anything using the Trivium method. This is the concept that's so revolutionary today. The Trivium is about how to learn. It's to learn how to learn, and then you can apply it universally to any subject. So when you're learning to read, reading is all about memory. It's about memorizing characters. Those characters have sounds. Those sounds it can be mouthed by the mouth, and you can hear them in your head when you think of that sound. These letters are just basically characters, and the characters come together to make more complex sounds with multiple syllables. And these multiple syllables can have meanings, because we have definitions for words. Words are basically multiple sounds together, and the definitions for those words have meaning that's conveyed through language. So the basic concept of learning to read is all about memorizing the characters and memorizing the sounds that those characters make, and then learning the words that those characters form as a group, learning the definitions, and then being able to remember that stuff when you need it at the time you need it. That's what it is to learn how to read. Writing is the similar thing, where you're actually doing the opposite. You're expressing yourself with those same characters in a way that is putting down thoughts on paper so anyone can read it over time and distance. And it's pretty amazing, because you can actually take an idea you have, write it down on a piece of paper, and anyone can read it as many times as they want, forever and ever, as long as the piece of paper is preserved. This is the magical quality of language, reading and writing. Now, the fascinating thing about reading and writing is that you can learn it pretty quick. An intelligent person coming to a country that does not speak the language or read the language or know the language can learn it pretty fast, and especially if you're immersed in the cultural. If you're actually immersed in the culture, you can actually pick this language up pretty fast. If you use it every day, it becomes habit, and you can actually learn things like that. I'm learning Russian, and it's very difficult because I'm not interacting with Russians on a regular basis. What ends up happening is, when I actually meet someone who speaks Russian, I end up getting into the back and forth. Hello, how you doing? My name is so-and-so. Have a nice day. Goodbye. You know, I have to go through the memory files of like, what am I supposed to say? What was that again? What was the sound? And I have to remember the translations of what I want to say. So basically, I have to have what I want to say in English translated into my mind into Russian, speak the words, hopefully correctly, with the correct diction so that it can be understood, and then they hear me and they respond. So it's fascinating. When you're first learning a language, you're constantly translating in your head. But after you learn the language to a certain point and you internalize it, you no longer need to translate it. As an example, I understand French deeply so I can actually listen to French television and I don't translate it in my head. I just know what they're saying immediately. I don't have to translate it into English and think about it. It just goes straight into my head and I know what it is. With Russian, it's the opposite. I have to hear what's being said in my mind. I replay it and I break the words up. I break the sounds up into words and then remember what each word means, translate it to English, then play the sentence in my head in English, and now I get it, right? So it becomes very laborsome trying to learn a foreign language, but it is worth the effort because it actually develops your brain. The point that I'm getting to is that people who are learning to read and write back in the day when the Trivium was being used were the colonists. And what's so fascinating about it is that the way the Trivium works is that you have to learn something completely. Then you have to take it and break it down to its most simple format and then teach it to someone else. These are the 3 steps of the Trivium. You learn it completely, then distill it down to its simplest possible formula, and then teach it to someone else. That 3 steps is what makes the Trivium work so well. Unless you know something, you cannot simplify it. Unless you teach it, you don't internalize it the same way as before you taught it. Because when you're explaining it to someone else, you have to do things in a very logical way that is not just a repetition scenario. And this is what's so fascinating about the Trivium, is that you can intellectually understand things to a certain level, but until you teach that thing, you don't learn it deeply. And until you try to simplify something, you don't really understand the complexity of the thing until you actually try to simplify it, because you have to understand the nuances. You have to understand the overall theory. Then you have to understand what you can dispense with and what is essential. By going through this process in your mind and distilling it down to its simplest form is how you logically internalize this thing, whatever it is you're learning. So when it comes to language and reading, what would happen in these schools that were basically, someone down the street had a house and they would actually just have all the kids over. And what would happen is the kids that actually knew how to read would teach the younger children who did not know how to read. So what would happen was the adults who were the teachers would teach the students when they were young, and then they would get those students who were young, as they grew older and became good at reading, would teach the younger students still how to read and write. So there was a constant learning, simplifying, and teaching going on. So every student who was new was taught by an older student who already knew how to do it. And then there'd be a little bit of intervention from the teacher, but the teacher didn't have to do much except teach perhaps the original batch of students, and then they would teach the next group of students, and there'd be some interventions here and there. But generally, what was going on was it was the students teaching other students how to do the thing, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic. And this is by using this Trivium method, they were very efficient at teaching each other. So these schools did not have a teacher teaching every student individually. It was that the teacher was generally regulating what was going on, when and how, and it was the students who were helping each other learn to read and write and do arithmetic. And by using the Trivium method, it was very efficient. It's an efficient way to do things. Everyone was involved in different ways. Some were really good at teaching, other ones were not so good at teaching, but everyone tried. And it was the process of trying whereby someone would internalize the process of becoming better at that thing. Even when you're learning something, you're doing badly at it, you're learning about what is your deficiency. And you can hopefully get over it. But until you realize where your deficiency is, you're not going to know what you need to work on. This is what's so fascinating about adult learning, which is basically learning forever. And right now there's actually a differentiation between adult learning and children's learning. And there should not be, because an individual can learn for their entire life. And when you actually use the Trivium to learn and teach, you become so much more adept at the thing you're doing. Whether it's music or art or reading and writing and arithmetic, whatever you're doing, when you actually apply the trivium and teach other people how to do the thing, you become so much better at it. And in a way that you never thought possible until you actually did it. This is what's fascinating about learning the trivium and learning how to actually apply the trivium, especially when teaching children how to do this. Now, what's really fascinating is that when you apply this in a larger scale, it's a very efficient way to disseminate knowledge through a large group of people, where a few people teach a few people, those few people teach a few more, and it expands outward. And eventually everyone knows the thing. So what happens is, in a small village, if there's a guy who's a blacksmith, about 20 people in the village know how to do the blacksmith job because they've all spent time with the blacksmith. So if the blacksmith gets injured, you've got 20 people that can take his place. They know how to do it. They may not be as adept at it. They may not be current in the thing, but they actually know how to do it, and they can step in if they're necessary. So this is what's amazing. The original villages were full of people who were so useful in every way you could think of. People who were the local bakers could be the blacksmith. They could be any job you can think of was basically multitasked to multiple people so that they all had the ability to do that in a pinch. So there was nothing that could not be done in the village, no matter basically whatever disaster happened. Everybody would just step forward and take over the job of the other guy. It's kind of like a military operation. Now in special military units, what they have is they have these specialist forces where there's a 4-man team, and each of the 4 men have specialties. So each one has a strong point, but then they learn the other guy's specialties as well, but not as deep. So the guy who's the radio man can do every other job if necessary, but his main job is being the radio man. But if he gets dropped, then the next guy can stand up and become the radio man and make things work. So special military operations today work like this. Whenever you need something to work in real life, this is how it's done. But back in the day, everyone worked like this. Why? Because that's how it was necessary to do things when you were trying to survive in the wild. Now, when you understand this concept, it gets really fascinating, because the Trivium method is a way to learn anything. If you want to learn art, you go to someone who knows how to do art and get them to explain it to you with the Trivium method, because they'll have to think about how to actually express things, how to give you examples to lead you to be able to accomplish certain tasks. As they're thinking about how to teach you, they're internalizing things, simplifying it down to its most basics, and then creating a curriculum based on their perceptions at the time. And these are always changing because we as individuals are constantly changing. There's a constant morphing going on in our ability to learn. Someone can teach art for their entire life and only become better at it if they're trying to become better at it. Some people are hopeless because they're just cruising through. But anyways, we're talking about people actually caring about learning about stuff. Now, back in the days of the founders, they would learn how to read and write, and one thing that they would read was actually the Bible. And because they actually really cared about the Bible, because they were deeply spiritual people, they actually cared about learning how to read, learning how to write, learning how to read correctly, and write correctly. So when they were reading the Bible, they actually cared about the words that are being said. They cared about the meaning. It was actually a very deep experience for them. And especially when younger children were able to read the Bible to their parents, they really felt valued. There was something about it that was very complicated, complex, multifaceted, and fascinating when you actually look at it in this context. So what ended up happening was people would learn how to read and write, and they'd be reading the Bible. All right, so the important part of this is that the Trivium is basically learning how to learn. It's basically the ability to take any subject, take it and learn it deeply to the point where you're an expert at it. And then once you're achieved expert understanding of that subject, you then distill it down to its most simplest aspects and teach it to someone else. This is the 3-part step. You learn something deeply, distill it down to its simplest parts, and then teach it to someone else. You can do this with any subject. If you're learning about mechanics, you can do this with a particular car or anything. Like you get for skateboarding. If you want to learn how to skateboard, use the Trivium method and go to someone who is a skateboarder who's good at it and teach them how to do the Trivium, and then they'll teach you how to skate in a very quick way that will be intellectually expedient for you and them. They'll actually become a better skater, and you'll learn how to do it. And it's that way with anything: skiing, snowboarding, any skill that requires a basic set of knowledge to be applied in the physical world. It also works with theoretical stuff as well, but just keep it into the physical just to keep it simple. And then when you go from the Trivium, you go to the Quadrivium, and then you get into the five senses, right? So the sound, which is music, the visual arts, which is your eyes, and you get into other things too. They used to get into every aspect of the five senses can be broken down in the Quadrivium, and you become an expert at all these things, and you actually experience more and are more capable as a human being. It basically is like a flowering of the human experience. All right, so what the point is that at the founding of the United States of America, people reimagined and reapplied the Trivium method and Quadrivium method to the children of the colonies. So the colonies people taught their children the Trivium, and they all learned how to read, write, do arithmetic. They're all musicians. They're all artists. When you actually start looking at the actual history of America, like there's so much that was done at such a short period of time. And the reason why is everybody was good at everything generally. Like everyone could play music. Everyone could do art. Everyone understood health and wellness and things like that. They knew how to ferment food and make apple cider vinegar and apple cider this and that. These are really well-rounded people that were very good at communicating back and forth, and they could hold a lot of intellectual ideas deep in their mind because their minds were groomed to be intelligent. There was no vaccinations at the time. There was very little pollution at the time. These people were achieving amazing things when they were not having to contend with the old powers of the old Europe, right? Many people who were the colonies, who filled up the colonies of America, were people who were escaping the tyranny of the Catholic Church or whatever local tyranny that was going on wherever they came from. And they all came to the United States of America to experience liberty and be free and to experience their maximum potential and give that opportunity to their children, and they did it. So what ended up happening is there was an explosion of intellectual expansion in the colonies, and this kind of scared the British a little bit, because at the time originally it was still British colonies. And then what ended up happening was within 2 generations you had all these people who were brilliant, capable, rational, and they're wondering, what's the point of continuing on with this crown thing, this British thing? Like, what's the point here? And what ended up happening was you had the old guard holding on, which was the retarded cousins of the king who want to hold on to power because the best thing they had going for them was that they were cousins of the king. They were pretty stupid. They didn't know much. They didn't need to know much. There wasn't a meritocracy, right? If you're just born in the family of the king, you just lived on the largesse of the king forever. So these guys and the people who were friends of them, who got money from the crown, who were stealing it from everyone else, wanted to maintain the system of the crown. But people who were self-made men, who were intellectuals, realized this is a bum deal. This sucks. Everything the crown touches turns to garbage. And if we just get them out of the way, we can actually be very industrious and do much better. So the colonies went through this amazing a period of time where they just intellectually blossomed. They were very creative, very inventive. There was all kinds of things going on at the time that were just amazing. And then finally, you had the setup, the preparing for the Great Revolution, right? When the colonies freed themselves from the crown. And what you have to appreciate is that after that revolution happened, the 1776 experience, just before that, 1775, you had Thomas Paine writing Common Sense. And this is the kind of stuff, when you read this, you're like, man, the Common Sense is fantastic. It's like a timeless book that speaks to common sense and against tyranny of all times, and it applies even to today. Now, Common Sense was like the spark that got everyone, riled up to actually go and cast off the thing that was the British Empire. And they did it. And it gets convoluted. There's all kinds of good and bad and villains and things that go on. Without getting caught up into that, the important thing is that the people of the colonies learned the trivium, and they were brilliant and they were capable. These are physical farmers that were farming, and they were physically fit because they had to farm all summer and then do stuff all winter. These guys were like real men, right? Lots of testosterone going on, and the women were real women, making babies, doing all kinds of brilliant things, playing, they were doing their things too. They were playing music, they were writing poetry, writing this and writing that. I mean, there's a lot that was going on at the time that was fantastic. Anyways, the point of the story is that the Trivium was what allowed the American colonies to overthrow the British Empire, because they were able to outthink the morons who were the cousins of the British Empire, the British family, who were just morons who were there because they were related to the king. So people with bigger brains could actually overcome other people who had this hereditary kind of privilege and stuff. Anyways, after the colonies cast off the king, they continued on with the Trivium method and the Quadrivium, and this is where there was just an expansion of industrialization and all kinds of wonderful things going on. Now, so the American colonies were made of brilliant people who were very capable physically. Now, what ended up happening was, over back in Europe, in a place called Prussia, so think of Russia, but with a P in front of it, Prussia was a kingdom. And the Prussian kingdom was run by a group of nobility that basically had their aspirations for greatness. And they basically started a war. But what they found is that the people who were in charge of the military tended to be the cousins of the king, right? So these are hereditary positions where it was like retard cousin Bob would become in charge of the military because he was the cousin of the king, right? It's not that he was a meritocracy. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't there because he was awesome. He was there because he was related to the king. So what ended up happening was a lot of the lower classes in Europe, they still taught the Trivium and Quadrivium, and even though some of them were not higher educated, they still had this type of education because it was the most practical way to educate anyone about anything, so they still practiced the Trivium. So people actually learned about logic and reasoning and how to articulate themselves, and they were very grounded individuals. Again, they were mostly farmers that were the peasant class and that were recruited into the army and stuff like that. Now, what ended up happening was the Prussian army went and did this big battle and lost spectacularly. Now, the reason why they lost is because the generals in the army would give commands, and the soldiers were not stupid enough to do the commands that were commanded of them by the generals. So the generals would just command the soldiers to charge the enemy, which would have been a death sentence. Like, they would have all just died. So because these people were too smart to be dumb enough to die stupidly, they would just not charge, or they would get behind something for protection. And what would happen was, at the end of the battle, most of the soldiers lived through it because they didn't die stupidly, but they would lose the battles, according to the perception of the generals. And this was like a problem, because not only was this supposed to wipe out a lot of people, because this war is constantly a depopulation program to kill off the alpha males. This is part of the thing going on. I've talked about this in some of my other podcasts. I'm not going to go into it today because it'll be too distracting. But the point is that wars are generally put on by the powerful to wipe out the alpha males to maintain the power structure. Anyone who would have revolted and actually caused freedom for their local population is recruited into the army, sent over somewhere else, and killed off against the other guys who are the alpha males. And they kill each other off, and all that's left is the beta males who just follow orders. So what ends up happening was all these wars just kill off the alpha males. So anyways, in Prussia, the alpha males were not stupid enough to die needlessly according to the commands of these retard generals. So what ended up happening was there was like a shame involved of like, oh no, your guys all lived. What's shameful? They didn't die honorably, right? It's like, honorably? What? They lived, So this is a problem for the aristocracy. They didn't have an army that was manageable to just go die at a drop of a hat. So they had to figure out a way to change this. And what they did is they sat down, they figured, okay, how can we make these guys just smart enough to follow orders, but too dumb to think it through so that they die easily in battle? And this is where they created the large classroom system. This is where they have the standard that's used today in education for the last 250 years, pretty much. They've been using this method to dumb down European society. since this Prussian War thing happened. And I think this was talked about in John Taylor Gatto's, one of his books about the history of education, and shows this evolution. So anyways, what they figured out was that, okay, they need to actually stop teaching the Trivium, because that makes people too smart and they're not dumb enough to die in war. So what they got to do is they got to stop teaching that. They need to actually just give people enough education so they can read and write, but not learn logic or reason so they can't figure stuff out. They need to just be following orders. So what they decided to do, they were going to reward people who followed orders and punish people who thought for themselves. And then they created these large classrooms of 30 people with one teacher. And the one teacher would teach everyone at once, and you had to just listen and follow along and do what you're told. Any kind of questioning was discouraged. Any kind of logic or reasoning or discussion was discouraged. All that was encouraged was listen, do what you're told, you'll be rewarded if you obey the orders. This is what was taught from grade 1 all the way through to grade 12. They reduced the amount of learning in the schooling and actually just increased the amount of filler. So the people were just spending a lot of time in school but not learning that much. They were being rewarded to follow orders and being punished if they thought for themselves. It's a fascinating thing. So anyways, what happened was you had a whole generation come through school like that. So 20 years later, after children that went through from like kindergarten all the way to grade 12, roughly, there was less grades back then, but just think of it as like kindergarten to grade 12 to make it simple for the equivalency kind of example. So you had this group that graduated from school, and they were not taught the Trivium. They were taught just this common education, obedient, and they did what they were told. They were punished if they didn't do it, if they didn't actually follow orders. So what ended up happening was there was another war. So Prussia got into another war 20-some years later, and now they had their new crop of soldiers, right? And this was a spectacular success because these idiot generals would order the army to charge into the enemy lines, and they'd all die. So it was considered a success that all the Prussian soldiers died spectacularly in the most stupid ways possible, that anyone with common sense would know you don't do that. You're just going to die. But these guys just died because they were not taught to think. They were not taught to question orders. They were taught to obey or be punished. So they just obeyed. If they were told, get up out of the trench and run into that spot, they would do it, and even if they all died. So the people who were the power brokers, the ones who were in control, realized like, wow, this is a good program. So they exported it around the world. Every Western country who wanted to have good, obedient soldiers who would die on command implemented this new style of education. And this is where you have the modern education system, where you have 30 children to a class with one teacher with a very strict curriculum. They discourage critical thinking. They discourage questioning. You're rewarded for following the order. You're rewarded for following the orders, and you're punished for not following the orders or actually asking questions, right? What this does, it creates an obedient population that doesn't think too much. All right, so this is a phase that happened over like 150 years, and then you had this new type of education. Then you had, in the United States, you had the President Woodrow Wilson, who was basically a communist who rebranded communism in the United States as progressivism. And with progressivism, they had this contradiction where in America, communism would not work because there's too much of a culture of freedom and liberty and things like that. There's the memory of the Constitution, even though it wasn't applied anymore. And there was the memory of what America was all about. So they were contending with the culture of the popular culture of the time. And they knew they wanted to bring the United States into communism, but they couldn't get away with the word communism because people knew what that was. They needed to dumb people down even more. So they brought in this thing called progressivism. And progressivism was progressing society from a group of independent people who were self-actuating and self-thinking and critical thinkers and inventors and entrepreneurs, taking it from that into a new thing that was basically a communist state in everything except name. And what they want to do is they want to have a society run by experts, basically white coat experts, and everyone would just listen to the experts and not think for themselves. And this is the way they thought was to manage the perfect society, is have an expert class just telling everyone what to do, and they would just scientifically figure out whatever society needed to do to get to whatever goal they want to get to. So this is like communism rebranded as progressivism. So 19, and then Woodrow Wilson was Woodrow Wilson was the same president who allowed the Federal Reserve to come in, and then they started funding this new type of government through the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is not federal; it has no reserves. It's a private group of banks that you're not allowed to know who they are, and you're not allowed to know what they're really up to. But they lend money to the United States government, the corporation called the United States government, at interest. So a private company lends money out of thin air to the United States, the fake United States government, which is just a corporation, but yet the American people are told you have to actually pay this money back. It gets very convoluted, but the thing is you got to understand the progressive angle on this. So the progressive president brought in the Federal Reserve to actually create the money out of nowhere where they can actually spend, and then built up this communist system that was called progressivism. You move forward, and then they went to the next warp, which was after World War II, right? They realized they needed to dumb down the soldiers even more. And okay, before I go to after that, there's the Rockefellers, right? So this is a group of a family that was called the Rockefellers that basically were in charge of the oil production in the United States. That became fabulously wealthy for many different reasons, but their most famous way of getting wealthy was through oil. They had this company called Standard Oil of New York, and then they expanded off to multiple different branches. But anyways, they amassed a huge fortune. And Rockefeller himself said that he wants a society full of obedient workers, not thinking entrepreneurs, because he thought it's counterproductive to an efficient business if you have a bunch of thinking employees. You want them just to be smart enough to follow orders, but not too smart to actually leave work to realize it sucks. So he actually decided to do two things. Number one, he took over the education system covertly by funding it privately, and then covertly took over the medical system to make everyone sick. So they realized to actually drop down the IQ of the United States, they had to actually monkey with everything from food manipulation to drugs, and they basically took the toxic waste from the manufacturing of oil products and then rebranded that as miracle pills and cures for the pharmaceutical industry, and the pharmaceutical industry was born. So they took toxic waste from the oil and gas industry and then just figured out ways to make it into a pill and give it to people and called it miracle cures, which made them sick, but then it made lots of business for the medical establishment. What they realized, though, is the more toxicity they could get into the human system, the more people were dumbed down, their IQ would go down, they were too sickly to actually revolt or think much. So there was one path, which was to make everyone sick through toxifying the air, food, and water. And it gets complicated from there, but you got to appreciate that's where it came from. Then you had this other thing where the education was taken over by the Rockefellers, and they're the ones who said that, oh, well, the state governments don't have enough money for school books, so we'll provide the school books as a generosity, a gratuity, because America's awesome. So what ended up happening was the Rockefeller Foundation created all these textbooks for schools and then created a curricula for teachers to teach that went around the local educators. So instead of actually teaching common sense stuff, they were teaching this curricula from the Rockefellers, which is all privately funded and had a specific goal in mind, which was to dumb down the population. And then that worked for a long time. And then eventually they wanted to standardize, they wanted to accelerate it because people were still not dumb enough. So we had World War II happen. After World War II, they left about 10 years to let people recoup and have a sense like things are getting back to normal. And then they doubled down on stupefying the population. And this is where they had the Rockefeller program, where they basically, what they did was they created the Board of Education. The Board of Education was about standardizing the education system for the United States of America. And what's really fascinating about it is the Board of Education came in and started just destroying everything, right? Making curricula that made people stupid, made them obedient, made them good slaves. They were punished for not following orders, and they were rewarded for just following orders, even if it was stupid, right? So there was this dumbing down of the population through the curricula and the food and the water and all that stuff. Also, they were using the old Prussian method of education where they'd have these classrooms of 30 people with one teacher. So there's an acceleration that just keeps bumping up, an acceleration of stupidity. What ended up happening was they wanted to standardize education, so the only people that were allowed to teach, because of the Board of Education and all that, were people who were professional teachers. So the good-natured individuals who want to help children learn and actually grow mentally were all kicked out of teaching, and the only people allowed to teach were the ones who went through the university education. And these people were taught basically communism light for a long time and didn't realize they were actually being indoctrinated into communism and being indoctrinated into pushing the communist agenda. Almost every teacher that comes out of university only graduates if they will accept and repeat the communist lines. If they do accept and repeat the communist lines, then they're given a place as a teacher to basically take control of these large classrooms and dumb down the children. If they do not go along with the program, they will not get their degree in education. So the only people who have their degree in education are people who are either overtly or covertly have been turned into communists. And then the program has been getting more extreme all the time, because back in the 60s, there's a whole pile of communists that said they were going to destroy America with the Long March through the institutions. They actually had a name for it. It was called the Long March through the institutions. And they said all of our people are going to take over every position of power within the entire country. We're going to take over the education system, and we're going to make it the way we want it. They want to dumb down the children to make them idiots who are just smart enough to follow orders and do what they're told and afraid of being punished. And this is where you have it today, right? This giant machine that's an education machine that produces people who are completely morons. Like, morons. It's a machine that generates morons, and it's there on purpose. It's created that way by the people who actually put it in place. And until you understand this, a lot of it doesn't make sense, and you need to follow the timeline for it to really come together in a way that fits together as like this tapestry, right? These guys are planning in centuries and implementing it in decades, and they have so many different people that are part of the big family that you don't see them coming until they've actually put their plan forward. Now we're going into a new phase of insanity where the children who are going through school now are not even taught reading and writing and arithmetic anymore. All they're taught about is feelings and transgenderism and climate change. So this is the thing. There's actually a program called SEL, Social Emotional Learning, that was put together by the United Nations. There's a subset of the United Nations that put this thing under UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education and Science Organization. I forget the exact acronym, but basically they're the ones who brought up this idea of social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is all about feelings are more important than facts. It doesn't matter if something is real or not. All it matters is how you feel about it. And the whole point is that they can manipulate your feelings this way if all they care about is your feelings. They make you feel bad about something, make you feel good about something. You can do something completely retarded, but you feel good about it because they told you to feel good about it. That's the point of the manipulation. They needed to do this first, and then they brought out the transgender stuff. And the transgender stuff is all about how you feel. You can just feel like a girl today, feel like a boy tomorrow, feel like a cat the next day, and no one can question your feelings because feelings are more important than facts and reality. And this is all about destroying society to flatten it and bring in a communist new world order. That's what they're trying to do. This is what they're working towards. This is their great agenda. And until you understand that, it doesn't make much sense. So to basically sum this up and tie a bow on it, say about a couple thousand years ago, all that there was a multi-class system where there was the people who were in control who actually had education, and they learned by way of the Trivium and Quadrivium to be able to read, write, do arithmetic, be able to be convincing in arguments, put their thoughts together and figure things out. And then everyone else who was not part of their team was basically ignorant, unwashed masses. And that's how they kept control of things for a long time. And then there was this period of time just before the Roman Empire took off, where there was a different kind of class where you could actually become wealthy enough to join their group. And then you could send your kids to these informal and sometimes formal mystery schools to get your family into line with the other ones that were in control. And then the Roman Empire fell apart. It was rebranded into the Roman Catholic Empire. And then the Roman Catholics kept control by only allowing two groups of people to study the Trivium. And this was the upper classes, the nobility, which you can only be born into. You cannot be made noble, N-O-B-L-E, noble. Sometimes people could be rewarded with nobility titles if they were, showed amazing courage in battle or did a lot of things for the king. But generally, it was a static system. It was them that kept power, and everyone else was the ignorant masses. That's basically what was going on for a long time. The exception to that was the church allowed their priests to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic so they could copy Bible texts and different books. It wasn't always Bible books they were actually copying over, is whatever the Catholic Church wanted. This is how they maintained control. They maintained control by basically controlling the educational system. So the only people who were well learned, who could think clearly because they learned the Trivium, were the people who went through the mystery schools or the higher education that only the noblemen can go to. So this is a class system that was kind of in disguise, right? As you move forward in time, you have different things happen. What ends up happening was, as you go forward, you get people who actually learned how to read and write, and they did it quietly, discreetly, but it was never open, because if it was openly known that they were doing this, they would have been murdered to keep the power structure in place. So fast forward to 500 years ago, this is where the printing press came out. With the printing press, it made everything easier because someone could actually mass produce books. And once you taught someone how to read, they could read those books. And this is where there was a major revolution in thinking going on, because just about anyone could learn to read. This is where there was a divergence in society. Part of it was controlled demolition of the old way. Part of it was an uncontrolled creativity that was going on. Just like the internet was created by the power structure, for them, the internet was subverted by regular people who were techies who wanted maximum freedom and developed the internet for common usage. So back in the day, the idea of the printing press and the implementation of the printing press was as revolutionary as the internet was to today, right, as a comparison. So there's always been a divide between those who can think and those who can't think. And usually the difference between them was the ability to learn how to learn. This is the key. This is the secret that they don't want you to know. This is how they control the masses. So what ended up happening was, you fast forward to 500 years ago, people started learning how to read and write. They were printing books. It became cheap to produce them in mass production, and people started reading the Bible for themselves and realized a lot of the things that are being taught by the Roman Catholic Church were not actually in the Bible. It was actually fraud. So the Roman Catholic Church really, lost their edge because of the ignorance being lifted by the regular people becoming aware. Then you go through 500 years of kind of insanity, but the general population started getting access to the Trivium methods of learning, and they started to get kind of wise. So what ended up happening was, in the colonies in the United States, this is where the big kind of reveal happened. When you have common people learning the Trivium, they can do uncommon things, and there's an explosion of creativity and innovation and all kinds of entrepreneurial stuff going on, because people were free from control. They were so far away from the power centers of Europe that they could actually have space to do what they wanted. And people want to generally be creative and create abundance for their friends, their family, and their community. This is what they did. And this was not allowed because the old powers of Europe wanted to hold on to power no matter what. Even if they had to kill everyone underneath them just to maintain power in the graveyard, they would do that, and they're still doing it today. So we had the American Revolution, and then as soon as the American Revolution happened, the British Empire was plotting how to take control back from the old colonists, and they did it by way of sending their agents over who got into politics. And then they completely perverted the concept of political will of the people. At the beginning, there was barely any federal government whatsoever. Most people live their entire lives and never come in contact with the federal government of the United States. And this is what the British government wanted to change. They wanted to make a massive federal government so that they could control the entire place. And this is what they did. They just step by step, they expanded and expanded and expanded the federal government until it was involved in everything. And they were the ones who were pushing slavery. So this is the old British Empire that was pushing slavery as a wedge issue, because in the colonies at the time, only 3% of the entire colonies was involved with slavery. 97% of the entire colony had nothing to do with slavery. That's why the people who were part of the government infrastructure, the British network of intelligence agents who became politicians, made it a law that you had to participate in slavery in the South, or you could become a slave yourself. So if you did not participate, if you didn't volunteer every 3 weekends to go slave hunting, you could be sentenced to slavery for 5 to 20 years. It's not voluntary when you're threatened with becoming a slave if you don't volunteer, right? But this is the ridiculousness of legal. So this small group of people controlled a large group of people to create a wedge issue that caused a lot of conflict, and that was the point. Conflict was the point. It kept everyone divided. And then they went through and had their civil war between the North and the South, and what that was about gaining more control. And it's all about making chaos. When there's chaos, there's opportunity, and they get to come in and actually seize control of more and more. And that's what they did. They took control and standardized the U.S. government right across the entirety of the United States. Now, this is all about gaining more control and changing things so there was a top-down power structure, a pyramid-style power structure. What they did is they basically took control and started making sure that regular people were too busy to do much education stuff. They started industrialization, right? And the whole point of industrialization was some people were very industrious and became very wealthy because they were very creative. But then this group of parasites came in and created this perverse style of industrialization where they put children to work at a very young age, and they had no hope. They basically would get sick and die at a young age because they were basically worked to death in these factories, right? So everything that was a good idea became perverted by this parasite class. The point is that they needed a dumbed down population. They figured if you're too busy working, you're not going to get an education. That only worked for a while until finally people started getting into the idea that, wait a second, our children should be actually getting an education because we think that's actually going to help them in the long run. And then there was these changes made to make education more a focus on the American life. But then the same parasite class came in and said, okay, we're going to do this. And this is where the Rockefellers came in. He said, no problem. We'll do education, but we're doing education our way. And their way, the Rockefeller way, was to dumb people down. It's to make them good, obedient workers who don't ask questions, just follow orders, and don't think too much. And that's what they set about doing. So the whole education system for the last 100 years has been all about dumbing down Americans so they can't think for themselves. And they've been increasing this ratcheting up of the perversion of the education system. Where before, people would go get educated so that they could be able to think for themselves, become entrepreneurs, be creative, and be self-made men and women. In the American education system today, it's the opposite. People become retarded, dumbed down, dependent on the system, and the government expands. This is what always happens. It's like a parasite. The government will make a law. It'll sound kind of unobtrusive at the beginning. Then they'll expand it. They'll seize a small thing. The next year they'll expand it and seize more. The next year they'll expand it and seize even more. It just keeps going on and on and on. It's this parasite that won't stop eating the host until the host is dead. This is their system. This is their control. And they have no self-control. These guys cannot stop themselves because they got one trick. They're a one-trick pony and they won't stop until we're all dead. This is how it works. The whole education system is meant to retard everyone, make us obedient slaves, and keep us downtrodden so we can never get out from underneath them. That's their plan. See, humanity's been dealing with the great deceiver since the beginning. And this great deceiver uses everything as a weapon. Even the concept of an education, knowing stuff, knowledge. People with knowledge are free and become prosperous. They can exercise their liberty and they can become creative, be entrepreneurs, right? Create abundance for themselves. The great deceiver and his minions weaponize everything, even education. So what they did a few thousand years ago is only the royals and the connected political class that was running things
were allowed to be educated. Everyone else was kept dumbed down and just smart enough to till the fields and tend the animals and breed more workers to tend the fields and maintain the animals. See how that works? If they needed miners, they'd breed some miners, and they'd dig into the earth. When they were done with them, they would wipe them out or keep a few. They would keep some certain knowledge sets. But this is what's amazing, is that if you control the knowledge, you control the capacity, because if you have to figure everything out from scratch, it takes a while to work it all through again. And to work it out needs a mental set, a thinking cap, the ability to think clearly, to use logic and reason, projection in your mind, to be able to problem solve. These are all skill sets that are learned through the Trivium. And the Trivium has been the magic element that the controlling class, the parasitic class, have withheld. They've weaponized education so that only the people who are working for them get to use it. The people who do not work for them do not get to use it. So the weaponization of education has been going on for a long time. So you had the mystery schools of old, then you had the universal education universities, then you get into the last 500 years where there's education more prolific because of the printing press back 500 years ago. And then things started going a little bit wild. So what ended up happening was they rebranded universities to be, instead of universal education using the Trivium and the Quadrivium to produce people who could figure things out, they switched it. And they did the switcheroo where they basically pushed education, but they did not provide an education. So in the last, say, since the 60s, what ended up happening was universities became exponentially more expensive. So the only people who could afford to go to university were people who were had the means to do it on their own. So they were independent and they had the means to do it, or they were getting government-funded education. But the government-funded education was where there was all these strings attached. You had to do this, you had to do that, you had to be the right type of person, there was quotas. This is where affirmative action came in. And they kept expanding the price of the universities so that only a few people could get in. And then what they did is they lowered the quality of education at universities so you'd get a degree and it was worthless. Even though you might have spent $100,000 to get a piece of paper to stick on your wall, they would actually direct which pieces of paper mattered and would actually hire you up. So they were actually in control of both ends here. They would provide meaningless education that was very expensive, and then they'd direct people, certain people, down that road, and they become unemployed. I mean, the biggest joke ever was like, what does a person with a bachelor's degree do for a living? Well, they serve coffee at Starbucks, right? Because someone who has no education and someone who has a Bachelor of Arts basically can get the same job, because the Bachelor of Arts is pretty much useless. And there's many other degrees that are similar to that. And this is what's, when you start actually looking and tracking this concept, the 60s is where there was this big push all about, education. Yeah, education is going to make a difference. In the United States, they basically had this culture war going on where they basically had a ghetto culture pushing downward on people. And then they had the government policies destroying families. So people were in these bad situations at home. It was broken families that were in poverty, and the government bureaucrats were actually using calculations to make sure people were always stuck in that rut. And this is how it works. You get stuck in the rut of poverty. And if you try to use the government outreach programs, they never do anything except keep you in the rut. You just keep going in circles and circles and never get out of it. Or if you do get out of it, you're in a worse situation because now you're in debt and you're not even much better off than you were before when you had no debt and life sucked. Now you have debt and life sucks. So it gets worse and worse. The whole point is that these guys use education as a weapon to actually brainwash people of good nature. People of good nature actually go to university thinking they're actually going to help society or help themselves, and they neither help themselves nor society. They get these useless degrees that are actually counterproductive to society, and then they spend the rest of their time trying to make this degree that they achieved, which is basically very expensive and not very useful, and they're trying to make it worthwhile. So what they end up doing is they end up trying to put it to work, and as they put it to work, they're destroying society. They're basically activists for the communist revolution, and they have no idea. So people with 101 degrees,
that basically are useless, end up going further and further into debt, and have this noose around their neck that they have to pay off. Now, what's great is that the government will often just nullify the debt of anyone who's like special people, right? If you're the right color. As in, if they decide you're a skin color that needs to be helped, they can help you and just wipe out your debt. If you're a certain tranny or something, they'll just wipe out your debt and make your life easier. See, the bureaucracy of the government works hand in hand with the education system. They're all on the same team. They're also on the same team as the banks, who are all involved in the same scheme. They're all working together. They're in a big team, and you're not in it. So this is what's more important to understand, is the history of education is the weaponization of thought. Certain people can think, and those ones who can think are entrepreneurs and engineers. They can figure things out. They actually create abundance in life. But if the power structure can actually dumb down the population to make sure there's very few entrepreneurs and very few people who can figure things out, what ends up happening is the society stays static, and the power structure maintains itself with the inertia that it has at the beginning. It doesn't get upset very easily. So basically it went from these mystery schools to the universities. Then the universities got dumbed down, and now it's getting to the point where it's basically the quickest way to become stupid is to go to university. That's the quickest way to become an idiot. If you just kind of figure things out on your own, you can actually figure a lot of stuff out. And most of the people I know that are the real innovators, that they are the entrepreneurs, that are the movers and shakers in life, do not have a formal education. Because of that, they've had to actually read books that they're interested in. And when they read books they're interested in, and they apply themselves appropriately, they can actually do amazing things. There's really a great book called Range, R-A-N-G-E, and it was written by a guy named Epstein. And he went over the history of the idea of innovation, and how historically the people who are the ones who are really making leaps and bounds in society, like innovative connections to things, were people who had a wide range of skills. People who have a wide range of skills and can think, can connect the dots between diverse intelligence apparatus, and can actually problem solve in ways that other people cannot. Why? Because they have access to information that the regular person doesn't. These people with a wide range of skills and knowledge can be very creative and come up with solutions that no one ever thought of before. This range that people have is actually usually self-actuated. It's kind of people that just like to read for reading's sake. They like to know things because they're curious. And these are the kind of people that actually come up with innovations. It's the kind of people that, figure out Velcro, right? So Velcro was created by someone just looking at a special plant that has hooks on it. And the way these hooks grabbed onto your clothing when you walk through the bushes, they thought was kind of interesting. And they thought, couldn't this be useful to actually apply this in a man-made way? And they figured out the concept of Velcro. It was from burdocks. Burdocks are like really annoying when they get on your clothes, but they're interesting, ingenious, natural adaptation. So the person who figured out how to do this created what was called Velcro. And then Velcro was picked up as a intelligence innovation by 3M, which is a big company. And then 3M went forward and produced like industrial strength versions of Velcro and applied it all over the place, right? They're the ones who basically made it popular and got rich off it because they took a great idea and then put it to work with the infrastructure they had. It's pretty fascinating stuff. But the guy who was creative about figuring out where Velcro came from, he was basically a nobody who had a wide range of skills and was observing nature and was able to put it to practical use. And this is what happens so many times in history. All the most interesting innovations or inventions are by people with a wide range of interests. And they basically converge, they intersect these wide-ranging interests into one specific solution that no one thought of before. And after people see it, they're thinking like, why didn't I think of that? And the reason why is because they did not have the divergence or the intersectionality. It's an actual positive use of the word. The intersection between these different skill sets, different knowledge bases, where they could actually overlap them and come up with a creative
application in a way that no one has done before. And this is what's fascinating. This is the kind of stuff that is trying to be stomped out by the education system of today. The people who are teaching education are actually destroying creativity. They're destroying imaginations. They're destroying the ability for people to actually be innovative, be creative, and be entrepreneurs, because all of that actually upsets the power structure and upsets the people who are paying the bills of these teachers, who do not realize they're communists. They're working for the communist goals. Some do, most don't. It's just quite amazing when you actually speak to teachers. I've got into some really freewheeling, wild, really wild discussions with teachers going over some of this stuff, and if they're not actively hostile from the beginning, then we can get into some interesting topics, and I can point things out that they've never thought of before. And it's just amazing because they've, some of them have been teaching for their entire career, right? This is like they retired after 30 years of teaching, 40 years of teaching, whatever, 25 years of teaching, and they've never had some of these thoughts. Like they just went through the entire career without ever thinking about what they're doing. And then when you point it out to them and they actually have the ears to hear, and they're not like devout communists, and they actually are willing to hear things and think about it, their minds are blown. They're like, whoa, what have I been doing? What am I part of? This is crazy. When you say these things, it makes sense, right? When you deal with logic, people, it's just the pieces fall into place. So the point is that education has been weaponized. There's a really great book that was explaining how everything can be weaponized, and everything that can be is weaponized today, because we're in a world war that we're not even sure the number anymore, because we've gone through several different phases. But there's a book called Unrestricted Warfare, and what's so weird about this book is it was actually written by a couple CCP generals, and it was either released covertly or released overtly on purpose to kind of mess up the West, to basically let the West know and sweat about it, but what was going to happen to them. This is part of the kind of the satanic order. They'll tell you what they're going to do to you in advance, and if you don't stop them, it's as if you acquiesced or consented to their thing. And even if they say they're going to torture you, you don't do anything to stop them, and they do it. You had the chance and you didn't. There you go. So the education system's been weaponized in a way most people have no idea. They can't figure it out. They don't see it. And the worst thing anyone could actually do today is to send their children off to school, because they're going to get them back, and those kids are going to come back completely retarded and probably thinking they're transgender. And if you don't get to them quick enough, they're going to do irreparable harm to their body, and your whole genetic line is going to be wiped out. It's pretty fascinating stuff. Most people have no idea. They're not seeing it. It's on the horizon. They lack the technical understanding. They lack the eyes to see and the ears to hear for what's actually going on. We're dealing with a multifaceted war zone right now, where everything is up for grabs and everything is a weapon. And this whole education thing, I mean, I actually saw a meme the other day that I thought was pretty great. And it was this crazy-looking, green-haired individual yelling, "If you don't send your kids to school, how are you going to know if they're trans?" And the response to that was, "Of course, that's why I won't send my kids to school." Because why would you send your kids to school when they're going to come back thinking they're trans? And if you didn't send them to school, they wouldn't have these stupid, illogical thoughts. This is how it works. So the whole education system has been weaponized. It's meant to dumb people down. And again, we're going through the system where they're taking something as simple as an education, they're giving it to the right people and withdrawing it from the other people. And this creates a difference. It's different pressures. Whenever pressures are building up in one place and are not in somewhere else, there's always going to be a balance trying to be found. So the point is, education is used as a weapon. They're trying to dumb everyone down so you can't think, and all you're good for is basically following orders. The whole education system at this point is actually not even educating with reading, writing, and arithmetic anymore, because there's whole graduating classes across the United States of America that cannot read at grade 12 level. They can't write at grade 12 level. They can't do math at grade 8, let alone grade 12. And the reason why is that the teachers all day long at school is teaching these kids about trans, climate change, and political activism. That's it. They're getting an education on how to be political activists and good government followers. That's it. it's pretty wild. These kids have no idea. They're coming out completely retarded on purpose, and they can't actually get out from underneath the issue they have because they don't even see what's going on. And one of the things that's really difficult these days is the parents have no idea either. The parents have no idea that they're actually participating in the destruction of their own children. By actually sending their kids off to these places, the kids are getting their minds warped. And parents, unfortunately, have this false belief that they need to send their kids off to get educated, or they're basically not going to do well in life. But the kids that I actually meet today that do the best are the ones who don't actually have a formal education. They're ones who actually learn skills, they learn trades, they actually are hanging out in the community doing stuff that's actually practical. They learn how to fix cars and learn how to do computer stuff that it requires no education at all. It just requires an interest in the access to the ability to learn how to do that thing. And once you know how to do it, you have a skill set that's useful. This is the thing, it's so amazing. Not long ago, people used to get trades and would do really well. Why? Because trades are needed. You need welders, you need builders, you need engineers to figure things out, to make sure bridges don't fall down, to make dams, to create power. These are all things that are quite useful. And what's amazing going on right now is that schools are phasing that stuff out, and they're pushing this other stuff about climate change and transgender, this and that and the other thing, which are completely useless. Useless. Like, that's the point. They're making education super expensive and useless. It's a double whammy of stupid. And if you don't know this is what's going on, then people are misled and think, no, the way to make my life better or my child's life better is to give them a great education. And that is true and false at the same time. Number one, any kid can do good if they're properly instructed on how to do things that are useful. But they don't need to go to school for that. Once you understand the Trivium and start applying the Trivium, you can learn anything. When people start learning how to learn things and learning how to teach, everyone gets smarter, more versed in the thing. Everything gets better in a way that's hard to wrap your mind around until you actually see it. Once you see it, it's just, you're wondering like, how was this not done before? How did I not know about this? This is pretty amazing. All right, I know this podcast has been all over the place. And it's been one of those things where trying to give the history how we got here, it's convoluted. It's a path with all kinds of loopbacks, twists and turns, ups and downs, and all arounds. And until you see the path of how we got here, you're not going to see what's going on and where they're planning on bringing us. They're planning on shutting down education in general so that people will have no opportunity to do anything other than do what you're told. Get your CBDC. Obey and life will be good. Disobey and they're going to withdraw food from you. They want to actually take the essentials of life and make those prompts in the system. You listen, you eat. You don't listen, you starve to death. That kind of thing. It's we're moving to a phase that most people cannot even imagine. What's amazing is that the people who are pushing this have been writing about it, they've been talking about it, they've been promising to do it for years, and they've been slowly fulfilling their plan right in front of us. And most people have no idea because they're not paying attention. And when you start paying attention and when it starts coming onto your radar, you can see it from a mile away. And that's the point of these podcasts. Just so you can see it coming, so you can actually do something to change the course and make sure that you, your family, and your loved ones don't fall for this nonsense.
We're going to close with a prayer. God, please move the hearts of the listeners. Move them in the spirit as only you can, to be better, choose more, and be examples of what you intend your children to be. Remind us in ways that only you can that we are the children of God. We have free will. We are co-creators of this beautiful world that you gifted to us, and we will have abundance if we but choose to, and act to manifest it. God, give them a vision of how they can fulfill their destiny as individuals here and now. We ask that you inspire us to be fearless warriors in spirit and the sword, to be shining examples of what we can do with our divine potential. Fear not. fear not, fear not. We ask that we manifest unwavering courage, the conviction and the heart to live a life worth living, to do our part to manifest a godly realm full of peace and love and abundance here and now. We claim our space as holy. In the name of Jesus Christ, we put on the armor of God. We pick up the sword of the Spirit. We will expand the kingdom. We will manifest goodness in this world. We say these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, this is the podcast on education. My first stab at trying to give a education-specific education about the history of how we got here and how people are being manipulated through the application or non-application of the Trivium as a method of learning, a method of learning anything. It's like learning how to learn, then learning anything. And then also how the educational system has been used to manipulate people to create a special class of highly educated and accomplished individuals, and then segregate society into another group of people who are not able to do those things. And this is where there's a stratification of society that goes on, and it's really fascinating to understand. Hopefully I've given some insights into that. I actually really struggle with this podcast because I made it over several segments over several days as I'm doing other things. And I was trying to actually break it into sections that might have been interesting and educational at the same time. And I found after, finishing this particular podcast that I have this sense that there's more that needs to be said. And so I'm going to do some more on it later when I think of what needs to be added to it, to the concept of education, to maybe sum things up a little bit better, add a little bit more information and update things as we go along. The world is changing really quickly right now. There's a quickening in the news. Part of that is psychological operations that is meant to keep you on the back foot so you don't know what's going on. It's hard to plan for anything when the future is basically uncertain. It's hard to be hopeful when there's so much negativity. And when the people who are actually pulling the levers of power are complete lunatics, they're psychopaths working with Team Evil, for Team Evil. It's difficult to be hopeful, but the thing is, they always fail. The reason why we don't have a worldwide satanic world order is because they failed every time they tried to do this before. Why do they fail? Because they're contrary to nature. Their ideas are contrary to human nature. Everything they think about and their ways of manipulating humans is based on human weaknesses that are actually strengths, seen in a different light. But their parasitic nature causes them to always destroy the host. They destroy every society that they've tried to take over and move towards this one world government thing. And they're going to fail again, except this time they're just going to kill a lot more people until the dust settles, and then they're going to reorient themselves and come at it again. This is a struggle that has been going on since the beginning. Man has always had to deal with this evil. Not long ago, though, people were not so dumbed down because of the educational system. Men were more manly. They were more deadly. They were more capable. They were able to do many more things than they do today. Why? Because of the education system that has completely emasculated men, removed them from their true nature in many ways, and created beta males everywhere. It's at the point where it's difficult to understand what is the difference between an alpha male and a beta male when the alpha males we meet are not even alpha compared to what used to be an alpha male. Anyways, I'm going to wrap it up there because if I don't, I'll just keep going on. And I think this is a good place to stop. Hopefully this is going to be a good educational podcast for people so they can get up to speed on some of the history that brought us to this place so you can understand where we're going. Thank you for listening. God bless. That's all for now.